For more than 6 decades, Sir Cliff Richard was Britain's unshakable symbol of music, faith, and perseverance, the Peter Pan of pop whose smile, voice, and grace seemed immune to time. But one day, as if the lights on the world stage had been switched off, he simply vanished. No tours, no albums, no interviews. Silence. For fans who had grown up with him, the sudden absence felt impossible. What could make a man who had faced down every era of music and fame suddenly retreat from the world he helped shape? This is the story of how that silence began, a story not of retirement or rest, but of betrayal, injustice, and survival. It begins not in a recording studio or concert hall, but with the thundering blades of a news helicopter circling over his home. That if this kind of story touches your heart, if you're someone who cares about truth, responsibility, and speaking up for the voiceless, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with someone who should hear it. Let's get started. By the time Cliff Richard turned 73, he had achieved something that almost no one in the history of British music could claim. Over 250 million records sold, more than 130 charted singles and albums, and hit songs spanning 6 consecutive decades. From his 1958 breakthrough Move It, often called the first authentic British rock and roll single, to his Christmas classics and royal performances, Cliff wasn't just a star. He was an institution woven into the fabric of Britain itself. Then in August of 2014, that legacy came crashing down. While Cliff vacationed in Portugal, his phone began to ring. Friends were calling, their voices trembling. "Cliff, turn on the news," one said. On the screen, live from a BBC helicopter, was his own home in Berkshire, surrounded by police. The raid was tied to a decades-old sexual assault allegation from 1985, an accusation for which there had been no charges, no interview, no evidence presented. Yet the world watched in real time as police officers entered his property. Commentators speculated cameras zoomed in, and within hours his name trended globally for all the wrong reasons. It was an unprecedented breach of privacy, and it would change his life forever. Cliff learned of the raid, not from the authorities, but from television. He later said it felt like being hung out to dry before anyone had even asked for my side. For a man whose entire career was built on trust, decency, and faith, the experience was annihilating. The psychological blow hit instantly. Friends remember his hands shaking uncontrollably. He couldn't sleep. His appetite disappeared. In weeks, he lost nearly 30 pounds. Doctors grew worried. The stress had triggered shingles, a dangerous condition for someone in his 70s. He woke in the night, drenched in sweat, sometimes disoriented, unsure of where he was. A man who had commanded stadiums and charmed royalty now struggled simply to get through the day. "It wasn't just fear," said one friend. "It was betrayal by the system, by institutions he had always respected." As the police continued their investigation, the media circus refused to die. For almost 2 years, Cliff lived under a cloud of suspicion, though he had never been arrested, never charged, and never shown evidence of wrongdoing. The entertainer who once thrived in the spotlight was now its prisoner. He hid away between homes in Portugal and Barbados, afraid of the cameras that once adored him. His voice, that unmistakable tone that had defined generations, fell silent. Behind closed doors, Cliff fought not only for his health, but also for his livelihood. The financial toll of the ordeal was staggering. Legal representation alone exceeded £3 million. He was forced to cancel a new album, postpone his autobiography, and call off a major tour. Losses estimated between £4 and £5 million. Sponsors withdrew, bookings dried up, and streaming figures fell as tabloids recycled the same speculative headlines. Even his Berkshire apartment, once a symbol of his success, became tainted. Its association with the raid rendered it unsellable. When he finally managed to offload it, the property sold for nearly £1 million less than its market value. For someone who had spent a lifetime earning an honest living, these financial wounds were as personal as the emotional ones. People assume someone like Cliff has endless money, said a music executive close to him. But legal wars drain you, not just your savings, but your spirit. And through it all, he refused to break publicly. He didn't give interviews. He didn't retaliate. He simply disappeared. After nearly 2 years, the Crown Prosecution Service announced in June 2016 that Cliff Richard would face no charges. The evidence, they said, was insufficient. For many, this would have been a moment of triumph, a vindication after years of torment. But for Cliff, the damage had already been done. In the eyes of the public, whispers are louder than verdicts. The BBC had broadcast his humiliation to millions, and no official statement could erase that image. Cliff knew that for some, he would forever be the man whose house was raided, not the man who brought joy to generations. He decided he wouldn't let that be the final word. Cliff sued both the BBC and the South Yorkshire Police, arguing that his right to privacy had been violated in the most sensational way possible. The legal battle stretched another 2 years, forcing him to relive every agonizing detail: depositions, testimony, cross-examinations, while tabloids waited to pounce on each new development. Finally, in July 2018, the High Court ruled in his favor. The BBC's coverage was deemed unlawful and sensationalist. Cliff won £2 million in damages, a symbolic victory that restored a measure of dignity, but at an enormous emotional cost. Even winning, one associate said, didn't feel like winning. It felt like crawling out of a battlefield. He had been cleared, but he was not free. For years had passed since that helicopter first appeared over his home. For years of silence, fear, and loss. When Cliff Richard finally stepped back into public life, he was not the same man who had left it. The sparkle was still there, but behind it was steel, a resolve forged in pain. His comeback was not explosive or heavily promoted. It was careful, deliberate, and deeply personal. He no longer toured endlessly. He chose smaller, more intimate venues. He controlled his interviews, ensuring his story was told accurately and respectfully. Fame had once been a game of access. Now, it was a matter of survival. He was more selective, more protective, said a promoter who worked with him after the case. He'd rather sing to 1,000 who understood than 1,000,000 who only wanted gossip. Cliff's priorities had changed, too. Instead of chasing hits, he focused on legacy, preserving his music, his message, and his story. He began remastering his catalog, curating anthologies that celebrated not just the songs, but the decades of history they represented. He also wrote The Dreamer, his 2018 autobiography, where he recounted the ordeal with courage and grace, using his experience to advocate for privacy reform and responsible journalism. Through that book, Cliff turned trauma into testimony. He wasn't just protecting his reputation, he was protecting the next person who might face the same nightmare without his fame or resources to fight back. Yet even as he reclaimed control of his life, scars remained. Friends say he still carries anxiety about unexpected knocks on the door or camera flashes in public. Decades of trust in institutions had been replaced with caution. He used to be open to everyone, one friend admitted. Now he's careful, maybe too careful. But after what happened, who wouldn't be? Still, Cliff's faith, the same faith that had carried him through 6 decades of fame, became his anchor. During the darkest moments, he said he found peace in prayer, not publicity. If I didn't have God, he told one interviewer later, I don't think I'd have made it through. That quiet spirituality guided his recovery. He began performing again, but only when he wanted to, not because contracts demanded it. He returned to television, but only under conditions that respected his privacy. The man who once seemed tireless had learned the value of rest. His new rhythm wasn't a retreat. It was survival with dignity. Perhaps the most profound change was how Cliff began thinking about legacy. For years, he had simply lived in the present, recording, touring, smiling, performing. But the ordeal had forced him to confront an unsettling question. What would be remembered when he was gone? If 6 decades of goodwill could be overshadowed by a single accusation, then legacy wasn't something to assume, it was something to protect. So he made it his mission. Cliff took an active role in preserving his archives. ensuring that his musical journey would be chronicled accurately for future generations. He poured time into his charitable foundations, the Cliff Richard Tennis Foundation, and several Christian organizations, emphasizing that his identity was built on more than just fame. He began choosing quality over quantity. Every new performance, every interview, every song was now filtered through one lens. Does this add to the legacy I want to leave? This was not the exuberant performer of the 1960s, nor the pop icon of the 1980s. This was a man who had survived public crucifixion and found peace in control. He didn't need to prove himself anymore. His music, his story, and his endurance already had. When Cliff Richard vanished, many assumed he was retiring, stepping away gracefully after a lifetime of success. But the truth was darker, deeper, and more human. He didn't walk away from the spotlight, he was driven from it. He didn't stop singing because he wanted silence. He stopped because the world stopped listening fairly. Yet, what makes his story extraordinary is not the suffering, but the strength that followed. Cliff Richard endured public humiliation, health collapse, and financial loss, and still found a way to return, not as a victim, but as a survivor. His disappearance was not the end of a career, but the rebirth of a man who refused to let injustice define him. Today, as he sings again on carefully chosen stages, his voice carries something new. Not just melody, but memory. Every note is a reminder of what was nearly lost and what it means to endure when the world turns its back. Sir Cliff Richard didn't vanish. He was silenced, and then against all odds he found his voice again. And when history remembers him, it will not be for the accusations that tried to destroy him, but for the courage that proved they never could.